Hey stragglers and tourists, my name is TheiPadCat and welcome to the 8th episode of my The Last of Us Could Have Been Very Different series, where we reconstruct and discuss one of the original storyboards from the game's development. If you just came across this video, I'd strongly recommend that you watch the series chronologically, since I guess this won't make a lot of sense otherwise. Anyways, in this episode, the role of protector and protected are switched up as we enter the cold winter once again. But let's not delay.
Let's get on with it.
The snowfall was picking up, lowering visibility. Looking out over the frozen lake, Ellie could still see the gathering storm off in the mountains. Whatever supplies and medicine she gathered now was what she would have to make do with for some time. She was still wearing her fall clothing, which made wading through snow painfully cold. The beach she was on was right next to a segment of a small part of some old mountain resort next to the forest, which left a lot of old shops and stores to loot after the apocalypse. Unfortunately for Ellie, all the other survivors during the past 20 years also knew that fact. Most of the buildings she went through were completely picked clean. Even things like furniture was taken in many cases. After going through an old liquor store and just about to leave, she saw what looked like a can of something behind the door. She leaned down and picked it up, and to her relief, it was an unopened can of beans. At least, she'd have some food for the night. She left the building and began heading for the next one. Halfway across the snow-covered street, she heard what sounded like a couple of muffled voices. Confused, she looked around and suddenly 2 armed men walked out from around the corner of a building further down the street. They must have been on patrol because they didn't notice her at first. Not wanting any trouble, Ellie tried dashing as fast as she could through the heavy snow for the nearest cover to hide, but not being properly dressed for the weather, she managed to slip, letting out an unintended ow as she hit the ground. She heard one of the distant voices burst out, asking his partner what the fuck that was. Ellie tried to get away as soon as possible, but they had already seen her. She managed to get out of sight just in time before they fired off their first shot. A little piece of the wall of the nearby building broke off as the bullet hit it. She only had her switchblade with her, and she hadn't even used that to kill anything. There was no way she was fighting these people. She had to get away. Clutching her only weapon, she decided to try and sneak out of this little part of the resort, using an old nature trail by the lake. The men were still talking to each other, and she could hear them splitting up to look for her. A small part of her wanted to give herself up to maybe find out that they were nice people and could help her. But then, she remembered what Joel had told her about hunters. At first, it seemed like she had gotten away, but just as she got onto the trail, she heard one of the men shout that he had found her. Ellie started running, but the men were quickly catching up. She ran along the trail for a couple of 100 meters, and just when the man was about to catch her, she jumped over a fence, down onto the lake itself, and started running for another part of the resort. The men didn't follow, but she could hear them saying that they'd let the snipers get her. She didn't think much about it. She'd rather dodge bullets than get caught. After running on the ice for a while, she finally started getting close to the main resort town. She knew that the house she was staying in wasn't that far away from there, but she had never been here before. The only reason she knew that this place was close to her hideout was because of an old map she'd found in her house. Upon getting closer, through the ever-increasing snowfall, she saw that the walls of scrap metal, cars and furniture were set up between buildings. It certainly wasn't the military who'd set it up, so it could only be whatever group those men were a part of. Keeping the snipers in mind, she tried to sneak as best she could, but it was hard to go unnoticed while being out in an essentially completely white field. When she reached the first few houses of the town, just outside the wall, a deafeningly loud gunshot went off. She quickly rushed into cover, freezing and clutching her switchblade even harder. After a little while, she quickly poked her head out and saw the glint of a scope in a nearby church tower before backing into cover again. The way back to the house was in the sights of the sniper. She'd have to carefully plan and pick routes between houses to get out of the town and back to safety. After what must have been half an hour of running in between houses and barely dodging sniper fire, she managed to get out onto the road leading back to her house. The adrenaline kept her on her feet. But as soon as she'd safely arrived and closed the door behind her, she collapsed of exhaustion on the floor. A while later she woke up. It was dark outside, so hours must have passed. She mumbled something about having gone through all of that for a single can of beans. She got up, but quickly realized why she'd rushed back here in the first place. She quickly headed downstairs into the garage, where Joel was lying on a bedroll. He was alive, but very sick from getting his wound infected. Luckily, Ellie had found some antibiotics earlier that day, before the hunters had found her. She took off her bag and put it on the floor. She didn't know if Joel was conscious or not, but she said that she'd found some food and medicine while she was out.
I only managed to get a little bit of food. But I did get this.
She opened the can of beans and ate a little, leaving the rest for whenever Joel would be able to eat. He was groaning and moving a little, but his eyes were closed. Maybe it was better if he wasn't conscious after all, Ellie thought, since she'd have to inject the medicine with a syringe. But then again, someone like Joel probably wouldn't be bothered by that, she thought as she put it in his arm. She didn't know a lot about sickness, but she could see a long way that he was dying. She didn't even want to think about the medicine possibly not working, so she pulled out one of her books and started reading to pass the time. The next day, the only food that was left was what Ellie had left for Joel for whenever he'd be able to eat it. She was so hungry that she for a second pondered about eating it herself, but didn't, which meant she had to go out scavenging again. And with the hunters out there looking for her, that wasn't the most appealing task, but she had no choice. Against her better judgment, she decided to go back to the town and check some of the buildings outside the walls. The storm had arrived and had its claws deep into everything around, which hopefully would provide a lot of cover from any patrols and snipers. After a fairly short jog, she arrived at the edge of town. It was snowing so heavily that she couldn't see the church tower where the sniper had been, which hopefully meant they couldn't see her either. She started searching some of the buildings, hoping to come across some sort of cache or storage for patrols going out or something. Going through almost all of the buildings facing the inland, she found nothing. She had to move on to the beachside part, but that meant going right past the church. All she wanted to do was just go back to the house and ride the storm out, but she couldn't. Exiting the building she was in, she hurried toward the beach. Visibility was so low she could barely see a few meters in front of her. She ran for a couple of minutes until finally feeling ice under her feet. The lake. She'd run straight past the church tower without even knowing. Maybe he or she wasn't even there in this storm, she thought. She began rummaging through the buildings, one by one. Nothing. After exiting her 6th beachside building, she noticed a fire barrel and a guard by another building a few dozen meters ahead. If there was a guard there, there had to be something he was guarding. So, Ellie decided to try and sneak around the back of the building and steal whatever supplies she could find and then get back to safety. With the storm not letting up, she easily managed to sneak past the tired guard and enter the house. It was mostly empty aside from a few cupboards in the old kitchen that had a few cans of beans and peaches, and a few energy bars. It was probably meant for whoever stood guard, Ellie thought, as she put it all in her bag. All the snow that was on her clothes and hands were starting to melt in the relative warmth inside the house. And as she grabbed the last can of peaches, her wet hand made it slip out and fall onto the floor, loudly echoing through the empty house. Ellie thought she'd have some time to get out and escape, but almost immediately the guard burst in through the front door. He seemed a bit surprised before rushing after her. She tried getting away, but her heavy bag and the storm slowed her down enough for the guard to catch up and grab her. She tried reaching for a knife, but the man choked her until she passed out before she could grab it. Meanwhile, back at the house, Joel woke up for the first time in a long while. He still felt the pain in his stomach, but it was manageable enough to stand up. He didn't remember how he got here. but he figured Ellie must have brought him sometime after the university. He was very hungry and saw that she'd left a can of beans on a nearby chair. He finished it in less than a minute and suddenly realized Ellie was nowhere to be seen. He shouted her name but got no response. There was a snowstorm raging outside, and if Ellie wasn't in the house, she had to be out there. He had to find her. After painfully walking up the stairs to the door, he saw a map lying on the floor. Ellie had marked the house's location on it. Joel picked it up and saw a relatively big town situated close by. She must have gone there for supplies, he thought, and opened the door. The faint footsteps in the snow outside, leading in that direction, was all the proof he needed, and as fast as he was able, he started making his way there. A big light shining right on her face made Ellie wake up. As she opened her eyes and sat up, she realized she was in a cage, and the light that had shone in her eyes was a bright ceiling light that someone had just turned on. She quickly got up and grabbed the cage bars and started shaking them and shouting to be let out, but nobody came. After a few exhausting minutes, she gave up. Just outside the cage was some sort of table. It was very blood-stained. Maybe she was in some sort of infirmary. What if these were nice people after all? But then, why would they have chased her and shot at her? So many thoughts were rushing through her head, she had to sit down. What if they were hunters? What were they going to do to her? She got her answer a few minutes later when two men came down the stairs into the room, carrying a naked, headless corpse. They didn't even look at her. These were no ordinary hunters. Horrified, Ellie looked on as the men chopped the corpse into pieces. She couldn't help but throw up, which caught the attention of one of the men, who simply and sinisterly said that she was next. She wanted to cry and scream at the same time, but did neither. A few hours, maybe more, passed, and the men came back. Ellie backed up to the corner of the cage and resisted all she could, but eventually got overpowered and lifted onto the table. One of the men raised his butcher's knife, about to kill her, but in the last second she shouted that she was infected.
I'm infected! I'm infected!
The man stopped himself, chuckled and said that he didn't buy it. Ellie, breathing heavily, told him to roll up her sleeve and look at the bite.
Right there. Roll up my sleeve. Look at it!
The man said he'd play along and obliged. But when her bite appeared, the other one asked what the fuck that was. The one that was about to kill her said that it couldn't possibly be real. And the other one interrupted and said that it looked real to him.
Looks pretty fucking real to me.
Arguing, none of them realized Ellie had grabbed the butcher's knife until it was too late. She lashed out as hard as she could and hit the man who thought the bite was real in the throat, rolled off the table and made a run for the stairs. The one about to kill her must have been shocked, because he didn't immediately chase after her, though he could hear him shouting for the alarm to be raised as she got out of the building. It was getting dark outside and the storm still hadn't settled. She obviously had to be inside the walls of the town, which meant there probably would be very few exits. And as if the storm didn't make it enough of a maze, she thought. After running for a while, she found what must have been her own footprints in the snow. Getting lost now was not what she needed. And as if the situation couldn't get any worse, one of the cannibals looking for her spotted her and alerted everyone nearby. She never knew she could run so fast before this moment. She could hear them close behind her. Desperately, she entered a large building, hoping she could find somewhere to hide inside and lose her pursuers. She closed the door behind her and realized this was some sort of mess or town hall. It was all lit up with fire lanterns, and it was fairly warm. The lanterns gave her an idea. She rushed over to the closest one and smashed it over the door, letting the fuel leak all over it and set it on fire. Hopefully, it'd hold them off until she could find another exit and escape. A few minutes later, and no exit found, Ellie realized setting the building on fire might not have been the best idea. The whole wall and some of the roof near the door was now fully engulfed in flames, and the smoke had started to make her cough. At least the cannibals weren't getting in. With that in mind, she continued to frantically search for an exit. Joel, after having slowly made his way toward the town, had now arrived at a wall of wrecked cars. The storm had finally slightly cleared up. He could hear a lot of shattering of what he presumed was hunters nearby. After scaling the wall as quietly as possible, he noticed a huge smoke pillar and flames coming out of a house on the other end of town. If anyone could have caused that, it had to be Ellie. If not for the smoke, he would have been terribly lost in the still heavy snowfall and narrow streets. After quietly killing a few of the hunters, he arrived on the far side of the fire, engulfing the building at some sort of external storage or pantry. He quickly entered and closed the door behind him. When he turned around, he was met by a morbid sight. Dozens of pairs of shoes, backpacks and other personal items were orderly put up everywhere. He mumbled about how much he hated hunters and went into the next room, where he was met by an even more terrible sight. Naked corpses with bags over their heads were hanging from hooks in the roof like slaughtered animals. These were no ordinary hunters. Just when he was about to exit the room, he saw Ellie's backpack leaning against the wall. Feeling the panic coming, he picked it up and burst through the door leading from storage into the main building. He was not going to lose another daughter. Heavy smoke entered his lungs and made his eyes itch. He called out for Ellie and started walking toward the fire. A few seconds later, a weakened and low voice answered and yelled his name. It was Ellie. He told her to keep talking. She tried yelling his name, but he heard her coughing. After a little while, he found her leaning against a wall, sitting down. She looked up at him, her face all full of soot and tears running down her eyes, saying something about what these people tried to do to her. Joel, adrenaline pumping, not even remembering his wound, picked her up and told her it was going to be okay, and ran as fast as he could out of the building. As bad as the situation was, the fire and the storm had caused enough chaos and distraction for Joel to safely escape the town and head back to the house with Ellie in his arms. Okay, so with this part of the story, there are a lot of different environment post-its, or whatever you'd want to call them. Lakeside Woods Beach, Lakeside Resort, Lakeside Town, Lakeside Beach Town, and Cannibal Town. And I just couldn't be bothered to strictly stay true to the environments because, well, I just couldn't, okay? That sounded a bit passive-aggressive, didn't it? Anyways, like with the very first episode of this series, where we covered the prologue, this part plays out largely the same as the actual The Last of Us, with only one major difference. And that is that there is no David. At least no mention of him. And the reason for that, I think, is that there was already this big bad constantly chasing after the characters with Tess. Yet another major villain character would probably not fit in all that well. Hence why the cannibals are still there, but no personification of their evil. But other than that, it's almost exactly the same. It takes place at the Lakeside Resort during winter, and Joel is dying at first, until Ellie gets kidnapped, and we have this back and forth switching between them until the climax in the burning building. The only other thing that isn't in the final game is a sniper sequence. Now, whether or not that was supposed to be a sequence of us, the player, having a sniper, or one where we have to avoid one, or one like we got in the game, with both, is not clear. But since it isn't specified, I picked the alternative I thought fit the best, since Ellie wasn't originally meant to kill anyone until the very end of the game. But that's basically it. Like with episode 6, there isn't really a whole lot to discuss here, so there's no reason to drag the video out over nothing. Do you think I did a decent enough job of reconstructing this part of the storyboard? How do you think the Lakeside section would work without David? Tell me in the comments down below and let's discuss it. And until next time, have a great day.